Yeah, today I wanted to talk about an argument that I've been developing, and it's connected with the topic of the conference on economic pluralism. So it's a discussion of an argument for worker participation in economic firms in a broadly decentralized economic system. So I've been working on this. There are just lots of moving parts, and there are a lot of uncertainties, at least in my mind, about a lot of the things. But I'm going to try to take you through the whole argument and try to get it to make sense here. Oh, you don't need that anymore? No.
No.
Okay. So let me say a little bit here about the basic project. So it's true that I've been working on democratic theory for many years, but I've sort of started a project on issues about economic justice. Is this?
Should stay near the microphone, that the people on Zoom hear you too. That's what
This microphone? Okay, all right, okay. So the project here is on economic justice, so it's a relatively new project over the last few years. The idea here in this project so far is to study the nature of economic justice, not primarily from the standpoint of distributive justice, which has been the most common kind of way of thinking about economic justice, but is to develop a procedural account of fair exchange, okay, that sort of goes beyond the demands of force and fraud, and that also avoids the need for a theory of equal exchange value. So those are kind of the two dominant traditions in some sense about procedural justice in economic exchange. And this is meant to, in some sense, avoid both of those types of approaches. We can talk about why more in discussion, but I thought I would just focus in on the basic argument today. So in that present paper, what it does is it tries to extend this idea into relations between labor and capital, which becomes, of course, as you know, very complex and difficult. And so, and the idea is going to be that that worker participation in firms, which I'll define in just a minute, can be justified as a remedy for a kind of violation of equality in the market. I'll try to say what that means. But let's say first what worker participation in firm governance involves. So what it means is that workers in a firm have a substantial share of collectively held power over the authoritative direction of the firm, and thus over some of the social world they live in. And consequently, workers have responsibility for how the firm develops in a larger market economy. So it's got both of these two dimensions of collectively held power and responsibility. And I'm using the word worker participation as a broad term that refers to what I describe often as a toolkit of different possible forms of worker participation. So one would be worker empowerment through collective bargaining and regulation of the workplace through unions. Another would be worker cooperatives, like the ones that have been discussed earlier today, or works councils. And then there are also combinations of these that we see in Northern European democratic societies in co-determination in Sweden and Germany and so on. So broadly, that's what I have in mind by worker participation. One thing to note here is when I think of worker participation in running the firm, I do not mean that workers have sole control over the firm. They share control with capital and other elements. Okay. Let me say something here just to give you an overview of the basic argument. This is probably too abstract, and I'll come back with it near the end, where hopefully you can see the elements having been filled out. But the basic argument is I identify a principle of equal capacity or equality of capacity, okay? That's a requirement of procedural justice in economic life. And I'm going to lay that out for you in some detail, well, in a little bit of detail. I've written a number of papers on the subject of this sort of basic principle of economic procedural justice, but here I'm just going to sort of flag some of the basic elements of it. The second idea is going to be a market organization that makes unequal power inevitable or very likely, makes it necessary that some people have to give up their ability to shape the social world that they live in to others, and therefore violates equal capacity. Again, I'll be saying more about this. Third, and I'm going to spend some time trying to unpack this and defend it, unregulated, imperfect markets actually do realize inequality of power and thus inequality of capacity under many circumstances. And so those are going to be the prime target for this principle of worker participation. So a form of market organization that mitigates unequal power by realizing worker participation without making the less powerful worse off ought to be implemented on this account. And that's what I'm going to argue. So that's the basic structure of the argument that I'm going to be pursuing through this presentation. Okay, so let me say something about the what I'm calling the egalitarian conception of agreements. So the idea here is that, all of us spend a lot of time, making agreements with other people. We agree to rent a place for a certain rent. We agree to a certain job for a certain amount of money. We agree to all kinds we buy things at the store. There's a huge number of transactions that we engage in our everyday lives. And the idea is, the root intuition here is that when we engage in agreements with other people, what we're doing is we're trying to give shape to the social world that we live in. We're trying to structure it, we're trying to organize it in various ways, that social world, to meet our needs, our desires, to express our individuality, and so on. It's mostly the local world that we live in that's doing this. Okay. And what we're doing, what do I mean by shape? I mean, what we're doing here is we're altering the rights and duties that people have, usually with us. We are altering the division of labor in some way or another. We're saying, one person does some task, another person does another task. And we are also engaging in some usually local distribution of benefits among persons, through wages and so on. So here's the key intuition that led me to this whole approach, which is there's something deeply analogous between the activity of engaging in agreement making with individuals and being a democratic citizen. There's a deep analogy, because what's going on in democratic citizenship is, at least I claim, is each person is trying, as an equal, ideally speaking, to shape the larger social world that they live in by shaping the structure of rights and duties in the society, the distribution of benefits, the division of labor, and so on, through policy and law and etc. So the thought is going to be something like the activity of engaging in agreement making is just analogous to democratic activity. It used to be that I called this conception a democratic conception of agreements, but I decided that maybe that was a somewhat misleading term because it sounds a little bit too centralized in some way. It is designed for a decentralized system of activity. And the idea behind this idea of agreements and its analogy with democracy is also similar, because as with democracy, the agreement making with other people is both a site of cooperation, so there, we get things out of it, and a site of conflict. I mean, the simplest conflict is I pay more than I want to pay, and you get less than you want to get. And so there's a conflict of interest between us whenever you engage in an exchange. This is why I think Mill called exchange a social act, because there's essentially a conflict of interest in the activity of exchange. But it is both cooperation and conflict at the same time, okay, where there are very distinct interests among persons in this process. Now, what I want to say is this basic idea that when you are in this set of relationships where there's a lot of cooperation and conflict among persons, okay, what you do is you say, and I think this is a kind of common and fundamental liberal idea, is you give power to people to be able to advance their interests in this context. That's what you do. I mean, not all liberals think this. Some people just say, oh no, you just have rights and that's all, and if they get exploited, who cares? But what I want to say is, no, what you do is you give power. And in democracy, you give power to have a say over the collective decision making. In agreement making, if we understand it as analogous to democratic decision making, then we can think in terms of these. We want a system of justice that gives people power to enter into agreements and to shape them with other people among equals, in a sense, okay? Now, the idea is then that they are to make these decisions in accordance with their own judgment. Now, again, there the analogy is coming further. So there's this idea of shaping the world, and then there's this idea there's conflict and cooperation, and now the idea is going to be, oh, just like you have equal power in the case of democracy, well, there should be some version of this in the case of economic exchange, okay? Okay. So the notion of power, though, in the case of exchange is different from that of what's happening in the case of democracy. They're different sources of power, essentially, okay? So really what I want to say is you can have power even in I'm going to talk more about this, in perfectly competitive and complete markets, which are the sort of the ideal of economic theory, like the Arrow-Debreu theorems about welfare economics are about complete and perfect markets. But you can also have power in the case of imperfect competition, okay? And the most basic determinant of power in the case of exchange is the ability to refuse the exchange. In other words, what happens to you if you don't engage in the exchange? If terrible things happen to you, then you have very little power. If it doesn't really matter to you very much, then you got a lot of power. That's why when a person saves another person from drowning, and they say, okay, I'll save you if you give me all of your life savings, that person who you're giving the rope to has no power, because their alternative is death. Your alternative is, well, you just have less. So the consequence, of course, is that person, if they exercise their power, they get what they want. And that gives you a kind of picture of how power in exchange works, because, and this is why I think with labor and capital you have such difficulties, because the capitalist usually has a lot of power. And I'm going to try to explain why that is, because I'm going to have a sort of story, a set of stories that have this kind of economic character to them that will try to explain how that happens. But the basic determinant is what's sometimes called the outside option. That's the basic determinant of power in economics or in economic life. So now the question is, so what's an egalitarian distribution of power? The idea is an egalitarian distribution of power, at least in terms of the outside option, is going to involve a very robust set of equality of opportunity, okay? Because the thought is going to be, well, you have the same opportunities as other people. And so as a consequence, your basic structure of outside options is the same, and so you can end up, so then you have a kind of equality, okay? This is not all there is to equality in exchange, as I'll say in just a minute, but it's a distinctive feature of it that's very different from the democratic case, where in the case of democratic, power is really, well, first of all, it's in voting power, and then it's in the power to communicate to possible voters, and so on, and organize communication. So this is quite different in this respect. So let me just say a few things about this basic principle here. So principle of global equal capacity is the principle that I want to articulate as the basic principle for an economic system, as a principle of procedural justice. There are two components. One of them, the second one, is the one that I've just mentioned, is a very robust conception of equality of opportunity for refusal, of consent, and of exit, okay? The other one is some global equal cognitive conditions. So the idea is going to be something like, it's essential for people to have power in economic life that they can have a grasp of what their interests are and what the implications of those interests are for the kinds of actions they have to engage in, okay? This kind of this is a procedural notion, so it allows some kinds of inequalities, okay? I mean, when persons knowingly choose different outcomes, then, from the base of, equal global capacity, then the idea can be, yeah, there's nothing wrong with those, with the outcome, okay, even though it might end up quite unequal. But there's a second one, and this is connected with procedural justice, and this disconnects it a little bit from distributive justice. Which is, I think, in the case of procedural justice, it makes sense that people who have greater talent at some particular task that's relevant to what people want to organize to do, okay, that they are, in effect, going to have some more power. Whenever you have a talent that is generalizable, then there are other people who are going to be interested in using it. And as a consequence, you get greater power. And so it may, and that's, I think, is going to generate, under certain circumstances, greater authority. Now, what I think is going to be the case is that the idea here then is that the distribution of income and wealth should not track differences in talents. I'm not going to argue about that right now, but they're just familiar arguments for that kind of claim. And so I'm just trying to pinpoint how talent might actually play a role, and the power that talent gives a person might play a role, a legitimate role, in a system of procedural justice. Okay. Oh yeah, I wanted to mention, this is kind of going off in a more speculative dimension here. I want to distinguish sometimes what I call collaborative power from conflictual power. And I think, to me, the easiest way to understand this is through the various economic notions. So if you take a talent, okay, and you think of, there may be a number of people who have this talent, okay. That talent may attract, more better positions in the division of labor and so on. And in that respect, it is getting better outcomes for the person who has the talent. Okay, but the thought is going to be something like, as long as the talent is, reasonably well, there's a fair amount of competition over it. That is, there are a number of people who have this talent. The thought is going to be something like, basically the talent is going to be used in a way that benefits everyone. Okay. The contrast with, so that's what I'm thinking of as collaborative power. In other words, somebody has a talent, they exercise it, and it benefits everyone. Whereas there's another notion of power here, which I'm calling conflictual power, which is power that's exercised in a way that is distorting in some way. The easiest case of that, and again, this is the economic case, is the case of a monopoly power. If you've got some talent or something over which you have a monopoly, okay, then what happens is you can restrict the supply and you can increase the price. That's the basic economic outcome of this. You restrict the supply and increase the price, which means you're making other people worse off in some ways than they could be, and you are benefiting. So that's why there's this deep conflict, okay? You get that in the case of, again, with talents where there's a monopoly. So that's one thing, when I'm saying that talents confer some power, I do not mean to be talking about the case where there's a monopoly of talent, but rather just, they're just people who have different different abilities, and they, they may attract, some greater capacity in a division of labor. Okay. Now, I want to talk about equality of opportunity a little bit more and explain a distinction that I think is really important, that is, I think, often missed, but which is the distinction between what I'm calling competitive equality of opportunity and what I'm calling constructive or creative equality of opportunity. The distinction can be first grasped by an example. I mean, the example is going to be, competitive equality of opportunity is going to be something like, you got a job that's posted, and the people who are choosing to fill that, to find somebody to fill that job, they have certain criteria in mind. The criteria and the job are set, and then you've got a bunch of people who are competing to fill that job. And maybe just one person gets it, or if there are more than one job, maybe a couple of people can get them. And the idea is going to be, there's something valuable about equality or equality of competitive opportunity there. You don't want to make it the case that some people have a better chance just because of some arbitrary reason than other people, okay? But this doesn't really capture all that's going on in the notion of equality of opportunity, and it's key to the argument that I want to make that it doesn't capture it in an important way. And that is, in the example that I just laid out, the thought is going to be, there's just this job, there are the criteria, and now me and this other person and these other people are competing for it. Okay, we don't have any say over what the job is, what the criteria are, or anything like that. Okay, but in economic life, if you try to broaden the position in terms of economic exchange, what's going to happen is people are going to choose what kinds of division of labor they want. They're going to choose what kind of criteria for different positions in the division of labor that they want. Okay, and of course, maybe I get together with these people because we kind of are like-minded about the kind of company or kind of firm or whatever it is that we want to structure. I don't get together with them because I don't like the way they organize things. Here I'm talking about, this is a super idealized picture of equals who are trying to figure out who they want to hang out with, so to speak, and who they want to work with. Okay, So constructive equality of opportunity involves this idea that I have power not only to compete for something, but I have power to construct a new form of organization that I think is the one that I want to try. Okay, and I have power to help determine the criteria and so on. Now the idea, the egalitarian conception of fair market exchange that I have in mind here, particularly when you're trying to create some kind of firm through exchange, is going to be one that emphasizes both competitive equality and constructive equality. Okay, to have just one and not the other is really bad, particularly if you've got just competitive equality. I mean, you can easily imagine a case of a society that's divided between masters and slaves, but you know, the children are all raised equally in some sense, and then they're given an equal chance to become a master or a slave. And so you either win or you lose, and then they all become masters and slaves. The thought is going to be something like they have no control over what the organization is or how it's supposed to work. And of course, it ends up in a deeply inegalitarian way. That's highly problematic. I mean, there are a lot of different ways in which this is problematic. I'll try to mention a couple. One is the division of labor itself is just fixed, namely it's between masters and slaves. The other one, of course, is that the division of labor is itself deeply inegalitarian, and it, in some sense, will probably hobble the people who are worse off in that division of labor over the long run. Okay, so the idea is going to be something like the equality ends at the competition, and then suddenly you get something really deeply anti-egalitarian. And again, with the idea of constructive equality, the thought is going to be something like you're both, there is competition, but you're also, as it were, thinking of different ways of organizing yourself with other people, and that's at least part of what's going on. All right. So I've just sort of given you some ideas about this idea of principle of equal capacity, and I've talked a little bit about equality of opportunity and some of the different dimensions of it, some of the different aspects of it, I haven't said that much about the equal cognitive conditions part. Maybe we can talk about that more, but now I want to start on a different aspect of the paper, which is really moving on to that second premise, which is the problem of social organization of markets. So, but the first thing to do, because this is really the core idea of economic theory, is to try to say something about what complete and perfectly competitive markets are. Okay, I mean, it's an extremely remote ideal. Complete means everything is traded. I mean, including 1 second of listening to Tom versus 1 second of listening to somebody else, everything. Because the De Bruyne, he says even moments are traded. But what's striking about complete and competitive markets is that, first of all, everyone is called a price taker. Price taker means no one determines the price. There's just a price that is the result of lots of interactions happening simultaneously, okay? And no one determines it. That's what being a price taker is. A price maker, like a monopolist, is a person who can increase the price and decrease supply. Okay, that's a price maker. And we're, of course, acquainted with this quite a bit. It happens quite a bit in ordinary economies. You get monopolistic supply or partially monopolistic supply and so on. The other thing that's one thing that means is that there's a significant lack of power there because you can't determine the price. The price is just there. You take it or leave it. But the other person hasn't determined it either. No one has. Okay, so there's also a complete system of securities, which means everyone is insured against all eventualities. This is not like the world we live in. In the world we live in, most of us are insured because we're in the academic world where, but if you're relatively badly off, you can't get insurance. It's very hard. Unless, of course, you've got a system where the government provides the insurance, which is why governments do provide insurance, because poor people can't provide it for themselves because they don't have collateral to pay for it. The other thing is, and this is something I was mentioning in one of the talks we had today. I think it was Michael's talk. In a set of complete and perfect markets, access to credit is easy because everybody knows what your ability is. They know what everybody's ability is. There's no information asymmetry. So I just borrow money because, if I exercise my talent, I'm going to make this money and I pay it back. I don't have to have collateral, which is what we normally have to have now because nobody knows what people's real talents are. So credit is totally different in a system of complete and competitive markets. Okay? There are no transaction costs, there's no information costs. That's the model. Okay? Now, of course, the initial distribution of endowments in perfect markets can be quite unequal, and that can affect the outcome. So that's a problem that, and I think you can't really have a fully egalitarian market without some initial distribution of endowments that's egalitarian, but that gets very complicated. But one thing is quite striking, and that is that because of the availability of credit in a complete set of markets, opportunities are open to people. It just depends on what your talent is. And you just borrow money to get that talent expressed somewhere. All right. But again, that's the basic model of economic theory. Now, of course, there are divergences, and the theories of economic markets have developed since the 1980s so that you include all these complexities like information, like Stefan was talking about mechanism design. The basic purpose of mechanism design is to overcome information asymmetries. So there's something that's not in these complete and perfect markets that is in ordinary exchanges, and then the question is you get a mechanism that is meant to elicit the right incentives from people. And so now in the sort of the basic Arrow de Breu complete and competitive market, firms, they are present in there, but they're totally just black boxes. There's nothing in them. They're just firms. And all they try to do is maximize profits. But there's no analysis of them in this classical model. Okay? Because there's a reason for that. Because firms, in some sense, only make sense because of incomplete and imperfectly competitive markets. Firms make sense because you need authority relations, you need rules, you need all kinds of things because there are a lot of transaction costs. If I go to work every day and I try to make a contract with my boss, my dean, for example, for everything I do, and we all do that, well, we're not going to get very far, are we? Because the transaction costs are just infinite after a while. Okay? So what happens is okay, let's put all that aside. We'll just create some rules for people, the dean tells me what to do, and then there's some rules that protect what I do, and so on, and that's how it works. A firm is a non-market institution. That's the most key feature of what a firm is. It's really a non-market institution. Internally, it's not a market, okay? And it makes sense in the context of incomplete markets with what are called incomplete contracts. Incomplete contracts are contracts that don't cover everything. So, what do you do when the guy doesn't do something? Well, you can't make a contract that specifies absolutely everything that everybody is supposed to do. It's too difficult. It takes too long. Okay? Now, in the perfect world of Aero de Breu, that's all there is. But in this world, it's too difficult. And so as a consequence, they're incomplete contracts. Okay, so then the question is, well, who gets to fill in the blanks? And that's where authority comes into firms. So, well, when there's a choice, when you got to choose between action X and action Y, then who gets to decide what you do? Is it somebody else, your boss, or is it you? That's what an incomplete contract is going to have to decide. Now, it doesn't mean that a firm has to be authoritarian, because it may be, well, there's a collective way of deciding all of this. But it does mean that there's an authority structure in them, which is foreign to market interactions. Okay? All right. So here's what's going on. In incomplete and imperfect markets, what's going on is that there are going to be a lot of distortions and difficulties in markets, okay? And what's going to happen is something like constructive equality of opportunity is going to be seriously curtailed because it gets too complicated. So what happens is you get rigidity in markets. Okay, so this is a key concept. You get rigidity. In other words, markets tend towards some particular form of organization. Okay, this is what you were worried about with Mill, right? I mean, so Mill says cooperatives. In some sense, everybody should want this, and there are a lot of cooperatives, but as a proportion of all the firms in the world, it's a really small proportion. Why? Probably Mill is right that a lot of people would like to work in cooperatives, but the fact is that you can't, okay? So there's certain kinds of rigidities in markets that lead to, I think, authoritarian firms, just to make a long story short. And they usually result from various forms of imperfections in markets. In fact, there is a theorem for perfectly competitive and complete markets which says it doesn't make any difference whether owners hire workers or workers rent capital. Doesn't make any difference. You can have either form, it's just as good. It's called a neoclassical equivalence theorem. Everybody accepts it. So in perfectly competitive and complete markets, it's totally open what you do. Okay? Now, what I want to say is when markets are rigidly biased against egalitarian forms of economic organization, they violate this ideal of constructive equality, okay, and this general ideal of egalitarianism in the market, okay. So one thing I want to say is that, at least broadly speaking, perfectly competitive and complete markets, at least with some reasonable distribution of endowments, they do respect equality of opportunity in the strong sense because of credit and insurance, which is totally available. So, the question is, it violates the ideal of democratic equality in the market. except if the rigidity is based on productive efficiency, and that's an important exception. But let me talk about sources of rigidity. So there are three of them are just background inequalities, okay? So for example, if you have massively unequal opportunity, a lot of people they don't have the chance to structure firms. They can't why is it that large numbers of people can't start firms? That's one big question. Why is that the case? Well, because they don't have any money. And you need money because you need money to get credit. And you need credit to start a firm. But you need the money first. If you don't have it, you can't get the credit, and then you can't you start the firm. So the background inequality is going to be a serious problem. The other thing, of course, is unequal education. I mean, in the US, the inequality of education is so appalling that it's hard even to imagine how bad it is. In fact, none of us probably can imagine how bad it is because none of us have really been in like the south side of Chicago on Woodlawn Avenue on 60th Street or whatever it is. So have a school, oh, sorry, there's no paper, there are no pencils here, and the teachers, they hate coming here because partly because there's no pencil and paper, and, who knows? So there's no education for large parts of the United States. And even where education is present, it's really weak for a large proportion of the population. But of course, you need education to be able to think through the kinds of problems that is necessary to create a serious economic firm. It's really hard. So background inequality is going to be a major source of rigidity. It's a major source of the fact that, people get sorted into capitalists and workers. It's a large part of it, okay? The other one is monopsony. So monopsony is where you've got, it's like monopoly, but in this case what you've got is one buyer and many sellers, okay? One buyer of labor, a lot of sellers of labor. People all the way back to Adam Smith noticed, what that means is the sellers of labor have very little bargaining power, especially when you combine it with background inequality, because if they don't make an agreement within a couple of days, they starve. Whereas the seller, you got one less worker, that's not great, but I can wait. So you have a massive inequality between these, and this does not require just being one buyer and many sellers. You can have just few buyers or relatively few buyers and lots of sellers of labor. It's enough to get this monopsony effect, and lots of economists observe a serious markdown in wages, which is just an indicator of power, as a result of monopsony, okay? Now, another source of rigidity is that owners of capital may be able to block movement to worker control. Okay, they may be able to block it. Why? Well, because even if worker control or some kind of worker participation created a more productive firm, it means less for the owner of capital. So they might still have a reason to block the movement. So one thing that's quite striking particularly about worker control, is the following. Worker cooperatives, they do not go out of business more often than ordinary capitalist firms. And they don't turn into capitalist firms. The problem of worker cooperatives is they can't get started. Okay, that's the basic observation. They don't get started. Okay, and the thought is, one reason why they don't get started is even if they are productive, what happens is the share that goes to the capitalist is sufficiently smaller so that the capitalist says, no, I don't want to give my capital for that purpose because I get less. Okay, that means you've got a serious social cost to not doing it. All right. All right. And of course, together with this, we know, owners do impose important external costs on workers in a whole variety of different ways. If you shut a firm, all these people are out of business. Why did you shut the firm? Well, because I took a risk and I made a mistake. Okay, so the risk, now an external effect of the risk that you took is now on the worker. Okay, this is part of the same problem. Okay, now there is one kind of thing. So this is why the question, why do worker cooperatives not exist? Why it's so important? Because there is at least one explanation that probably holds sometimes, which is such that would show that worker cooperatives are not a good idea. Which is one explanation that's been offered, and there's a very famous legal theorist, Henry Huntsman, who's offered this, is that, what happens with workers is if you get a lot of workers in a firm, they have divergent interests. And so it becomes very difficult to make collective action, or at least relatively difficult. It's slower, it's harder. Okay? And so as a consequence, it slows down the decision-making of the firm, and as a consequence, it's less productive. Okay? Which means, if you had an economy with all of the firms were less productive than the ones that you have, than another one, then that means the human needs and desires are much less well satisfied in that firm, in that context. And if you have a market, then where this dynamic seems to hold, then what's going to happen is people are going to go towards an authoritarian firm because it's cheaper. The cost of production is lower. And as a consequence, people are going to make more money using it. Okay? That's the Huntsman. I'm not saying I endorse that explanation, but it's that kind of explanation where you want to say, okay, no, that's not. If that's the explanation for why there are less worker cooperatives, then you want to say, well, maybe there shouldn't be more worker cooperatives. Maybe. At least if you put a lot of priority on the satisfaction of human desires and needs. Okay. I don't think those kinds of arguments are generally successful, but it is worth thinking about it. This is one of the reasons why I focus on this toolkit of different types of employment and different types of worker participation. Because my guess is that for a lot of different contexts, different forms of worker participation are optimal. And in some contexts, worker participation may not be very optimal. But in other contexts, you're going to get a lot of optimality. Okay? So the first three forms of rigidity are violations, I think, of this ideal of equal capacity. What they do is they either are based on unequal opportunity to start with, or two, there's a structural feature of imperfect markets which automatically disempowers one group relative to another. And it doesn't matter who's in it. Whatever group you're in, you're disempowered if you're in a monopsony situation. Okay? And plus, of course, the uncontrolled ownership of capital also can disempower workers because it will get a socially suboptimal distribution where the capital controls controls it all the time. The fourth form is not as necessarily a violation. And the reason why I say that is because I do think that the purpose of markets is the satisfaction of human needs. So if you've got a very clear superiority in productivity for some certain kind of firm, then that's what you want to choose. Now, not everybody's going to go with this, but that's the way I'm thinking about it. And we can discuss that. We can debate that in discussion if you want. So what I want to say is, if the explanation is monopsony or background inequality or owners of capital blocking the thing, then I think the thought is going to be worker participation is going to be a remedy for those things. What you have to do is you enter into the market, you try to legally restructure it so that in effect you have to have some kind of worker participation. There are lots of examples of this. Obviously, the co-determination laws in Germany and in Sweden, the National Labor Relations Board in the United States, although much weakened now, at least used to be a lot more powerful, and maybe it's becoming a tiny bit more powerful now. Those are all ways of restructuring labor markets so as to increase labor participation. And that's a remedy. Because the thought is going to be that when you get the monopsony or your background inequality or owners blocking the use of capital, what you've got is you're allowing a serious kind of unequal capacity to determine how the market works. And now what you have to do is, in order to stop that, you introduce an external legal form that then says, no, you've got to do this by means of, these firms have to be structured, or have to be structured by worker participation, or you have very strong positive incentives for it, and so on. Okay, so now we can see, this is the same slide as I had before. Now you can see, hopefully this basic argument makes a little bit more sense now. Maybe not much more, but a little bit more. So equality of capacity is the basic requirement of procedural justice in economic life. And the thought is the market organization that makes unequal governance or power inevitable, or very likely makes it necessary that some people just don't have much control over their lives. And the egalitarian theory says, no, the fundamental standard has to be some kind of equal power principle. Okay, I mean, you can have inequalities, but those inequalities have to be such that they're the closest to equality you can get, and they're superior to any realizable equality. So this is not a leveling down notion of equality. So now the thought is unregulated, imperfect markets actually do often realize inequality of power under many circumstances. That's the argument of these various rigidities that I laid out, okay? Except the productive efficiency, which makes it a little more complicated. So that's the basic argument. But again here, I want to emphasize this because I think some people will have different views than the one that I'm suggesting here. So worker control, or some degree of it, is not an entailment of an egalitarian conception of markets. It's a remedy for when something is going wrong, when there are imperfections or market failures that generate inequality, okay, that are rigidly biased against egalitarian structures. It's possible on this account of the justification of worker participation that there are no firms with worker participation. But that's only if the reason for this is that people don't want to participate in these firms. I mean, I can imagine that, at least. I mean, somebody wants a job and they say, I don't want to Like you were saying, I don't want to go to meetings. Personally, I like meetings. If they're productive, I like them. You know what I mean? You listen to each other and you make some progress. I like those meetings. I've learned that. I just became head of my department just a little while ago. And the difference between the productive and the unproductive is acutely felt. And so, but when they are productive, they're enjoyable. It's like everybody is participating. That's great. But I can imagine people who say, no, I don't want to think about that stuff. I want to think about, I want to think about Plato's Republic and what he's talking about, and I just don't want to think about anything else when I go home. I can understand that. It's not impossible. This is a kind of pluralism which we have to accept. That there are going to be people with preferences who just don't want to participate in that kind of thing. But I don't think that's going to be the general form of persons. So, anyways, the thought is going to be something like, you need some kind of collective action to structure these firms, okay? All right. Now, I do want to say make one little distinction, because I'm sure many of you, so the standard argument that people have made for worker participation, at least in the last 20 or 30 years, maybe it's too strong to say it's the standard argument, but I think it's the most prominent argument, and it's the one that everyone will recognize, is that of Robert Dahl. It's a wonderful little book called A Preface to Economic Democracy. It's really nice. I encourage anybody to read it who hasn't. And Dahl says, there isn't really much difference between a state and a firm. Just isn't that different. And so democracy, he's one of the world's premier theorists of democracy. Democracy is the fundamental standard for evaluating states, so it should be for evaluating firms, period. End of story. He spends a lot of time, developing this argument in a variety of different ways. And most people who talk about worker participation do actually endorse some version of this. That's why it's called the parallel case. They're like two different things that are very similar. And I want to say that these aren't the same. They're very different phenomena. The state, first of all, is something where it's really hard to get out of. That's only one part of it. The other part is the state is responsible for justice, at least as I conceive it. Whereas I don't think a firm is responsible for justice. And justice is really hard to achieve by a voluntary means. There are models of states where you try to, federalism models, where you try to divide it all up. This guy, Charles Thibault, where he says, if there are no transaction costs and there's no cost of moving from one place to another, then you can get all the public goods you want out of a decentralized system of states. But you can't get justice out of that. You can't get distributive justice out of that. That is, that's just a fundamental observation about that thing. And the state, I want to say, is its prime responsibility is the establishment of justice among citizens. And you cannot do that with a voluntary mechanism. Firms, on the other hand, they participate in creating goods that satisfy human needs and desires. Of course, there's issues of fairness within the firm, but their prime focus is not the creation of justice. Okay? So I want to say there's something fundamentally problematic about the parallel case argument, which is one reason why I think, okay, we need a different, if we have an argument, there's got to be a different kind of argument, okay? Okay, let me just finish the last couple minutes here. I don't even know what time it is, because I can't see.
10 past.
Oh, 10, okay, so this is 1 minute. So what's the role of capital in all of this? So I kind of said it earlier, and we can talk more about it, but What I want to say is it's not unjust for capital to have some role in the way firms are structured and in what they do. Okay? I mean, it's the result of people's savings, it's the result of people's various activities. They advance capital for various kinds of purposes. I mean, if you think in terms of the basic idea I had in the beginning, which is, well, this is how you help shape the social world you live in, well, advancing capital in a certain context is going to do that too. Okay? But what I want to say is, unlike the way, well, certainly in the United States, the way it's done, where capital seems to have almost entirely the upper hand through shareholder power and so on, the thought is going to be something like the right of capital to have some say is limited. And it's limited by this more basic principle of equal power. So it has to be found, its position has to be found within the more basic principle of equal power. Okay, so the various arguments that people give for capital having control, like savings and risk-taking and so on, are either not specific to capital, or they're not enough to create full control or full rights to control. And so that's kind of the basic idea. But I do want to say, I don't think we have reason to think that capital must be excluded from having a say in how a firm runs. I think what's the difficult argument is to try to make the argument that their workers must be included, and that's the argument that I spent most of my time with. But I want to say that capital can be included as well without injustice in this sense. And so that's the basic conclusion. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very, very much for a super interesting talk and for keeping so perfectly to time. Lots of hands. And there's a microphone. I don't know your name, sorry, I know you're a first year student. Maria, and I see the microphone's right behind you. If I ask you to start us off, and then I'll. Yeah. And then I'm just making a list, so we'll get my information.
Yeah, thank you so much for the excellent talk.
Oh, so one thing, can I say something here?
Oh, of course.
Whoever talks here, you got to raise your voice.
Okay.
Because I can't really hear anything.
Okay. Thank you so much for the excellent talk. I suppose the main question I wanted to, I guess comment I wanted to make was about the point you made about the fourth form of rigidity, like productive efficiency. I thought it was an interesting sort of point you brought up, especially in connection to some of the other talks we've seen and participated in today, because of the idea that sort of, as you said, that should productivity suffer to some certain limit, then worker co-ops, that would be a reason to not have them. I was wondering to what extent though that kind of ignores to how like the productive relations that we already exist in shape human desires. So like the idea that I don't know, because we're already like raised and educated and cultivated by a certain system that prioritizes efficiency of production and like an expansion of markets already, then that just shapes people to think that they want more. But like how much can we really say is that like a conception of life, I suppose? I don't know if I'm really posing so much of a singular question as sort of pointing to that as like I'm kind of skeptical of that as like a reason to as a way to validate rigidity, I suppose. Yeah, I just thought that was a really interesting point in your talk specifically. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you for your question. No, so I thought there were kind of two different things that you were concerned with. One is productive efficiency a legitimate concern and maybe we can put it even a little more weakly by saying, is it sufficiently legitimate to make it the case that sometimes it's okay if a market excludes a certain kind of form of organization on the grounds, if the explanation is a lesser productive efficiency. So that's one question. The other question was, you were saying something about how our preferences are shaped by the society. Was it just that the preferences are for productive efficiency are shaped, or is it, I mean...
Yeah, I think so. I think that's what I was going along the lines of, is that like why, just
Yeah.
kind of underlying assumption that we want greater productivity.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Well, okay, so this is something we have to talk through. I mean, because what I think is, I do think that I mean, this Hegel, this is where you get with Hegel as well, or I think even with Plato, the idea, the purpose of a market is to satisfy human desires and needs. So if you have a more productively efficient type of firm, then it can do that better than the less productively efficient. So in some sense, it's doing what the market is supposed to do. And now again, remember, the background idea here is that, well, but a just market has to be one where people have something like equal power or as close to equal power as you can get. But the thought is going to be something like, you don't want to increase power at the expense of the welfare, particularly of the worst off members of society. I think that's got to be the basic. Now, it's important to understand what I mean by that. I mean, where that connection is really direct. So, of course, you may end up making the worse off because the rich won't invest or something like that. And that's one of the forms of rigidity that I think is not legitimate. But if it's genuinely the case, as like Henry Hansman says, that, well, there's a certain form of production which is you just implement it, and it's just less productive. And which means, again, and the thought is going to be, if you make, for me, the focus here is going to be, if the worse off parts of societies, or the lower half of the income distribution, are made worse off by this, then I think that is an argument for thinking that productive efficiency is important. That's the way I'm thinking of it.
Thank you so much. I really clarifies it.
Wait. Hi, is this loud enough?
Yeah, a little louder. Just project.
Projected,
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I thought it was really interesting. And similar to what Austin was just saying, I had a very similar question, kind of along the lines of applying it to the world, kind of like as I know and like in my experience, is that, for example, teachers are part of a teachers union, and every 4 or 5 years they've been going on strike, right? To change their contracts, right? To do the work to rule stuff and everything. And every single time it has impacted me as a high school student, as an elementary school student, right? Would that be an example of rigidity that is valid to then say that these teachers should not participate kind of in the cooperative? Or is that a different form? I'm just trying to kind of conceptualize it in terms of unions and services and just kind of put it into the present day sort of.
That's a good question.
How that plays out.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'm not totally sure how to answer it. I mean, I guess I think the right to strike is really important, and I think that the ability to strike is something that should be preserved. But I guess I can imagine circumstances where the striking becomes so frequent that it obliterates the activity that's supposed to be engaged in. I think I can imagine that. And then in those cases I might say, okay, we need to change something about this institution. But if we're talking about a strike every few years or every 5 years, where it's maybe a couple of weeks or something like that, and you get a couple of days, a few days off from school, which everybody's pretty happy about, then I would think, yeah, that's an exercise of power that they ought to have, and it probably benefits the students in the long run anyway, because they get happier teachers. But I don't know. I'm not sure. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Great. So I think next on our list is Fernando.
Thank you very much for your talk. Can you hear me? Because I can't just speak. Okay, I'll speak louder. One of the things that I wanted to ask you was in regard to a little bit following with what Maria just said. If you don't have a stake in the company and yet you have control, because I fully agree with what you're saying, but there can be also this criticism, right? Like workers are not investing their capital, etc., and yet they can have too much control. So do you see a point there that could be valid, or a way to sort of reach a common ground where control?
You mean if there could be a circumstance where a group has too much power over it? So,
Yes,
I mean,
just thinking back in terms of cooperatives, the members have to stake their own capital, and so if it all goes under, and if they're making important decisions, in a sense they are not staking other people's capital. So maybe someone can criticize that workers are having too much control over something that maybe the only stake there is their own investment of time, of moving there, of working, and having to find employment elsewhere.
yeah. I think that is a plausible worry, that what you're saying, namely that if the workers are getting capital from somewhere else, it makes sense for the owner of the capital to have some say in these decision making. That I think is right, and I think it would be. My guess is, yeah, I think you're pointing to a problem, which is, well, if you get the capital, but the capitalist has nothing to say, and the workers have everything to say, then the question is there a problem of moral hazard here, which is, they'll misuse it, or this has been something that people have worried about with worker cooperatives. Yeah, I think that's going to be a problem. So, so one thing that has been noticed about worker cooperatives in particular is that they tend to be labor intensive and not capital intensive, and partly for, I think, the reason that you just mentioned. Partly it's because the workers themselves don't have that much capital, but then other people aren't going to give them the capital because they're worried that they're just going to lose it, because they don't have enough incentive to use it. Framing it in terms of the overall thesis here, the thought's going to be something like, well, it's probably going to be plausible in a case like that. So even if you do require worker participation, that you don't make it exclusive, you don't exclude owners of capital from participating as well, because if you do, then you may not get investment of capital. I think that's, and then the market won't work very well in that kind of context.
So, in line with what Fernando just said, and given the current situation of the U.S. market, right now, we have all of these abnormal situations in the market, going upward. We have the Federal Reserve being hawkish and increasing interest rates. Job openings today were higher than expected, and there's more demand for work than workers. And it seems that nothing of this, well, especially the last part, the part of being an excess of demand, is benefiting workers. It has nothing to do with labor or with worker participation.
Right.
It's just completely something that happened because of monetary policy, basically, by the Fed. So, what would you? I'm just curious, like, what is your perspective on that?
Yeah.
And then, like, we have seen also some moral hazard, as you said, in this situation, especially with the stimulus package money, where workers weren't going to work because they were receiving more money from the government than
Right. Yeah, good. No, those are great. I mean, so yeah, worker participation is not the answer to all questions. And so, I mean, I think, my own personal reaction to the current situation is, yeah, this is great, because, yeah, the demand is higher than the supply, or in some sense, it's in some ways higher than supply. And so as a consequence, wages should rise, although we haven't seen them rise as much at the lower level as I would have hoped. But however, I don't think this is totally unrelated to worker participation, because I think this is also related to the rise in union activity. So part of the reason why there's more union activity is because, I think, of the high demand for labor and the fact that these firms are in trouble and they need labor. And so if you need labor, then you're going to be a little bit more receptive to their demands, including collective bargaining. Okay? I mean, if you think of a case where you've got a market which is pretty egalitarian, like markets and very high skilled people, like computer specialists and maybe to some degree professors a little bit, although the universities are kind of a weird system, so they're not really a market in any sort of, I mean, in the US it's a little bit more of a market, but they get a lot of worker participation because that's one of the things they ask for. They get a lot more satisfaction of their demands. But the thought is going to be something like, when you have people with a lot of market power and facing others with market power, they can get what they want. In some cases, they don't need collective organization, or in other cases, they just get it. Like football players in the United States, they have collective organization, even though, So I agree with you, and I agree with, here, Adam Smith, in effect, right? Adam Smith says, look, the reason why wages go up is because there's a high demand and a low supply of labor, and that's just what happens. And I think that does happen. And that has played a role over the last couple of centuries in raising labor wages. But I think there is just another factor that plays a very large role, which is worker organization. So here's a case of that. So this economist, who's normally, I'm not sure what he is, but this guy Larry Summers, he's often thought of as a kind of a conservative Democrat economist. He wrote this paper with this economist Anna Stansbury, and the paper is called The Declining Worker Power Hypothesis. So the question behind the paper is, what is the explanation for the massive increase of inequality in wages over the last 40 years? And their answer is, a very large part of the explanation is the decline of unions in the United States. It's not international trade. It's not, there's also some theories about corporate form and stuff like that. It's a lot, they don't say all of it, but a very substantial part of it is due to lack of worker organization. And of course, it is true that the whole American system of government has been attacking unions for the past 40 years. Biden is the first person really to be kind of, okay, yeah, I like unions. And that if Summers and Stansbury are right, and a lot of people, economists and labor economists, think they are right, then the collective organization plays a huge role in raising wages and worker power. Does that help? Does that answer your question in some way?
Say yes, but then maybe.
Well, we haven't got time for follow-ups, unfortunately. So I've got the microphone, so I can get you out of the yes but no there. I'm going to call on Igor on Zoom. While you're unmuting yourself, just to say that we have 9.5 minutes and 4 questions. So if I can ask people to be short in questions and I guess also in answers, though we do want to hear what you've got to say. So that would be great, then we can all get out of here on time.
You can't get
I'll try and be as quick as possible and also to project this way virtually and physically. I really enjoyed the presentation. Glad that Smith was referenced, and also Hansen. One thing that I remember from Hansen is that this barrier to entry, some of the barriers is also legal. And because you mentioned that one way out of this predicament, many predicaments with respect to barriers to entry, I would involve passing a coercive law that would say you can't do this, something along those lines. You mentioned the problem I see is sort of the Adam Smith problem we anticipated when it comes to the dealers. Those interests do not coincide with the public interest. And that's why his argument was that, well, anytime there's any policy being formulated, or any kind of law, we have to be especially vigilant when it comes to the dealers who have misled the public and are right to mislead the public. So the reason why I raise this is because if it so happens that the law can also be directly influenced by the capitalist class, not directly, but indirectly, for reasons that we are aware. But what does that mean for the possibility of enacting legislation that would say, no, you can't do to prevent barriers to entry? So it's a revolving door problem. Right? How do we prevent the revolving door problem to make the work of cooperative succeed, even if we put aside the efficiency issue you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, good. Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, I think part of the answer, I think part of the answer has to be, I mean, I think it's the only answer you can give in a democratic society, which is part of the answer has to be, you got to be able to make the argument that you've got this tremendous inequality that's arisen as a consequence of policy over the last 40 years, which have been destroying all kinds of forms of worker participation. And, you know, the idea then is going to be something like, you have to make that argument, and what you have to try to do is make sure that you get enough people who are going to vote for that position. But it is hard to get into it from a situation now where we're way outside of an egalitarian scheme. I agree with that. I mean, because one partial answer, but which is doesn't answer the question fully, but because I think there are other arguments for worker participation. For example, another argument for worker participation is that it turns out workers who participate in firms either as union members or as members of worker cooperatives and so on, they're much more sophisticated political participants than people who don't. So the consequence, and the system is much more responsive to people like them. But of course, in the US, what we've seen is the system has been they've been undermining unions and cooperatives. And as a consequence, I think we're also seeing the kinds of things that unions used to fight for, they're often not being fought for anymore. So the question is, how do you turn that around? This is a bit like Rousseau's problem, right? I mean, if you have a society, that is not regulated by the general will, then nobody sees what it is and they can't figure out how to do it. And particularly if it's ruled egoistically by elites. But I guess I think there is a place here for political organization in a democracy to try to organize people so that they vote for people who vote for strong worker participation. And I think I think we're in a position now to make arguments like that politically, because people are, I think, even many elites are pretty outraged by the level of inequality that they see. It just does not sit well with a lot of people, at least enough. It doesn't sit well with them so that they actually, they'd like to change it. But I think we're in a moment now where we can start to make arguments for increased worker participation, for increased protection of workers that we have not been in for a long time. And I think political organization can help do that. But I agree that it's a hard road to go on when a lot of elites are benefiting from the inequality. But that's the best I can say.
Hey, Tom.
Hey.
So I've got a question about just the larger dialectic and potential things that you can do with this hammer. So you've got this hammer. Right? There's this key idea that what's really important is an equality of power, a kind of equality of power in these bargaining situations that structure the social world, and it relates to economic production. It's kind of in that context. And so there's this further argument that to redress imbalances in that equality of power, you need to bring in worker participation. But it seems like, well, you don't stop there. There's a whole suite of things that you might consider and assess using this lens. I mean, one thing that would be really clear is public education. That's got to be something. Yeah. Another possibility is the state as an employer of last resort, so that increases the exit option possibility for folks. Yeah. Another might be, if there's this problem with capitalizing workers' cooperatives, maybe we need to have some sort of state control, maybe through Federal Reserve banks or this kind of thing, where there's democratic choices about who gets capitalized. Yeah. It's not just the profit motive that's generating that for the capitalists. So you can go on and on. Maybe property owning democracy is a way of looking at this thing. So it seems like you have this nice device for assessing a whole bunch of proposals that are floating out there. Right?
Yeah. Good. No, that's right. I mean, so in the sort of the exposition of the sort of larger project, some of these other alternatives that you're mentioning, more powerful welfare state with greater redistributive capacity and better system. I mean, better system of education is just too obvious to you know, but unfortunately it has to be said, you know, so, but, you know, other things are antitrust, for example, is another kind of consideration. So yeah, the idea is supposed to give kind of a general framework from which a number of different types of conclusions can be generated when a society departs from that basic standard. But yeah, no, that's right. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I saw a hand, so I guess it's like related, so go ahead.
So you mentioned that we can't justify democratic worker participation in the same way that we justify the democratic participation through states, because the states are specifically responsible for justice in society. So in the same way that the states are responsible for justice within their domain, can't the firms be responsible for some limited form of justice within their domains, and thus be justified in the same way, through the same logic, therefore be forced to use some form of democratic worker participation?
Yeah, no, I think to some degree firms do that, at least to some extent. I mean, because it is, I mean, there's still a lot of research to be done on this, and I'm not an expert, but it does appear that sort of workers' willingness to work and put out effort is itself partly dependent on a perception of fairness in the workplace. So there's some evidence that there is that perception, and there's some serious empirical evidence that there is that perception. So there is some degree to which, yeah, the firm, it's just going to be important that a firm, you know, exemplify fairness at least in ways that the members of the firm see it. I mean, another one of this is, you know, now I don't know how good this case this is, but also this corporate responsibility movement, which is now trying to emphasize diversity and inclusion in the corporate workplace, I think is another instance of that. And a lot of that is worker driven. I think so. I don't want to overstate the claim that the firm has nothing to do with fairness. I don't want to say that. What I want to say is that if you look at the totality of the firms in a society, they don't together have the job of bringing about justice. It's the state that does that. They are going to be concerned with, because each one of us is more or less constantly concerned with at least some degree of fairness in our interactions with other people that we interact with quite a bit. So they will be doing that to some degree, but it's very different from the state. You know, when we're talking about trying to introduce justice in the state as a whole. First, partly because it is harder to introduce fairness into the workplace just because people can leave, and they often do when they don't like what they're seeing or something like that. But whereas in the state, it's a little harder to do that. But yeah, they're not as distant maybe as that I was sort of making them out to be. But I do think that there's a difference in order of concern, which is the prime order of concern, I think, is that the firm produce things for the satisfaction of needs and desires. That's the prime concern. Fairness is a process, is something that people want to see when they're working together with other people. Whereas I think so it's a secondary in some sense, whereas in the state, in some sense, I think the prime function of the state is justice. And that can't be achieved by voluntary means. That's part of the problem. Whereas the firm, gets organized on a voluntary basis for the most part.
Okay, great. So we're officially out of time, but I know two fellow conveners have a question, so I want to give you a chance to ask it. And you seem to have the power to say along with the other room, right? So.
I have a conceptual challenge, and so we can discuss
Good.
it out in the den, but I will pose it for everybody.
Good. Yeah.
So it is more, but it's not, it's more about how realistic we want to be, whether this is really not a leveling down equality, because I'm not convinced by that. I don't think that this is a big issue, it's more about the realism about what one is proposing. Because, and three short arguments. First argument depends on the perspective you have and the position you have now in
Right.
society. We want to build a society from scratch, and I think even we professors, university professors, for us it will be leveling down, and my empirical evidence will be how reluctant philosophers, for example, are to take on less pleasurable jobs within academia, so how hard it is to find a chair for a department, for instance. Yeah? Second argument would be the question is how much hierarchy is actually sociologically necessary. You have an efficiently functioning market. So the argument would be there will always be more people who are talented to be foremen than we need foremen actually. And even when we have some democratization, so 5 years or 1 year foreman A, B, C, there might always be more people talented to be foremen than foremen we need. That would be the third, and all is an adaptation actually of the Simmelian argument. The third argument would be then maybe even social differentiation is already sufficient to have this the need for a leveling down. So again, the example would be Germany and Austria. High school teachers are very well paid, are very socially recognized, but nevertheless, it's hard to find enough high school teachers, in particular in Germany. On the other hand, university professors, very similar, has even some disadvantage in comparison to high school teachers. So high school teachers have don't have to have the same kind of mobility. They can choose the city in which they want to live and so on. But nevertheless, a society might always need more high school teachers than university professors. So you always have more need for high school teachers. But the problem is the demand. So the more people comparatively, proportionally want to be university professors than high school teachers. So you will always, in all societies, have the situation that for some people who want to be university professors, they have to become high school teachers. Hence the experience, although these are very equal jobs, the personal situation they have is a leveling down. So I think you won't get rid of the leveling down, particularly not when it's equal opportunity, because also of the last example, that only differentiation is sufficient, that you have this problem of supply and demand when it comes to the kind of jobs that are on offer within modern society.
Good. So there's a lot there. So we probably will have to talk about that more, hopefully over dinner. But let me just say a little bit about leveling down. I haven't really said that much about it, but let me just make sure. So I'm advancing some sort of principle of equality here. And a standard worry about principles of equality is that, oh, you're willing to level down so that if you have inequalities where everybody's better off, but they're inequalities, and there's an equality where everybody's worse off, you're willing to I think Kurt Vonnegut, for example, I don't know, maybe people haven't read that, but there are a lot of people who discuss this type of leveling down objection, and it's a standard type of objection to some kind of principle of equality. What I want to say is, one, a principle of equality, and I have tried to construct an argument for this in another paper, has to avoid leveling down to be true to the fundamental ideas behind the principle of equality. Now, your question is, but leveling down from, what's the baseline? I think that's sort of like so I'm thinking really of leveling down from the standpoint of Yeah, the society overall. So yeah, I mean, so the thought is going to be something like, this is why this productive efficiency thing matters, but your question shows that the productive efficiency idea needs to be really clearly stated, because the thought is going to be something like, if there's a form of social organization or firm organization that is just genuinely much more productively efficient than others, and it is for that reason, only that reason, that it survives in the market where those others don't, then I want to say, we can't reject that. We can't reject that form of social organization, even if it does produce some inequality. Now, a little note to the leveling down issue. So one question that one has with leveling down is, well, okay, so what's the right principle of not leveling down, right? I mean, so Rawls's difference principle is a kind of anti-leveling down idea, right? It says, well, yeah, you can have inequalities as long as the worst off are better off than under any alternative circumstance. That's a kind of anti-leveling down principle. It's not one that I accept, because for well-known reasons, which is that, so you mean you have one person who's a little bit better off, but everyone else is massively worse off than they would have been? You still want to reject that? You might think, yeah, there are cases where even the one or two worst off people, maybe it's okay that they be even worse off if everybody else is much better off. And of course, Rawls's principle is complicated, and we'd need to talk for hours about it. But at least what you need, though, is what's the right way of thinking about what's an appropriate kind of leveling down and what isn't. Now, the kind of leveling down principle that I would endorse, and I haven't really constructed a full version of it, is one which does generally favor the interests of the worst off, but it's got to be broad classes. Actually, that's kind of the way Rawls thinks about it too, but it's got to be broad classes of people. So if you've got a form of organization which gives more power to equal power to people, but the consequence of it is that the lower half of the income strata are significantly worse off as a consequence, then I think that might be a serious criticism of it. Not that I think that normally happens. I'm just thinking of this as a conceptual possibility, because this paper is kind of a framework paper, right? It tells you, okay, these considerations are the right ones, these considerations are not, and so on. But I haven't really given a good definition of exactly the exact character of the leveling down principle that I'm endorsing. So yeah, that needs a lot more work, and but thank you for the question.